Oh man, finally my games came in. I can't wait to take a look. What? Greatest hits? How many times has that happened to you? You think you've got a great price on a game only to get it and realize that you have the greatest hits version and not the original Black Label. It is frustrating. But I'm here to give you some extra tips on how to avoid circumstances like that and to learn a little bit about greatest hits lines and repackages. Repackaging games that have sold well and placing them on a discounted list has been around for a long time. Now personally, I know Nintendo was one of the first to do it with the Player's Choice games, started way back, I believe, on the Super Nintendo N64 era. When they sold 1 million copies, they'd get a greatest hits release, cheaper price, recirculate the game, so people can buy more. Now, following suit, PlayStation did the same thing with the greatest hits line, Xbox has Platinum Hits, Sega had All-Stars. It's a really common practice. But for the sake of this video, I'm going to focus specifically on the PlayStation greatest hits line, just to make it easy and so we know the terminology I'm using and it doesn't get confusing. Re-releasing games that sold well under a greatest hits line, or whatever you want to call it, is a common practice for a few reasons. From a business standpoint, it makes sense to release a game again that it sold well so more players can get around to finally playing it. From a collector standpoint, though, it's kind of the opposite. Greatest hits games have some benefits, but for the most part, collectors want to avoid greatest hits games. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples here about things that go one way or the other, some tips you can learn from, and some things to look out for. So, pay attention. One thing to keep in mind when collecting video games is to realize and understand how greatest hits games affect the collector. Now, like I said, usually a game will come out with the Black Label and it sells well, and you get a Green Label version. Now, these are terms that I'm using because it's what's most widely known online and in collecting circles. Obviously, this is the repackaged greatest hits. You can see it is a green label here. That's why it's called Green Label. If you see it online or some auction, someone says the game is Green Label, GL, greatest hits, that all means it's something like this. Now, if they say the game is original or Black Label or BL, that is this, because look at that, it's black. So it's pretty easy to follow. And the system continued through a lot of pretty much every system that Sony has done, except when it went to the PlayStation 2 and onward, they still called it Greatest Hits, but now it's a red label. And so it follows that games online that are Greatest Hits for PS2 and above would be called Red Label, RL, or still just Greatest Hits. Not to be outdone, Nintendo, the originator, and Microsoft, the late joiner, did the same thing. Right here we have a Platinum Hits game, which is the same thing, Greatest Hits version of an Xbox game. The Nintendo's Player's Choice game, same thing, and even Sega had it when they were still in the console market. The Dreamcast had Sega All-Stars. These repackaging games still exist in Japan, Europe, other places under other titles. Japan's PlayStation 2 games are the best series, so you can see them all over the place. It's a common practice. Due to them being re-releases, greatest hits games are almost always priced lower than their Black Label regular versions. A good way to notice this online is when you're looking at eBay auctions. Almost unanimously, if someone knows what they're selling, when they sell a greatest hits version of a game, it'll likely be less money than the regular Black Label version of the game. And that is because collectors such as myself and you would rather have the original Black Label game over the greatest hits. Okay, to give you some examples of how this works, let's look at Final Fantasy VII. I like this game because it's a good example, people know what it is, and it's still sought after in collector circles and regular fan bases alike. So this version of the game, the greatest hits, would cost you about 35 bucks if you're buying it online through eBay. The Green Label is less than the Black Label, which is about 50 bucks, maybe even more, depends on when you buy it and who you buy it from. And another example, a bit more recent, sticking with Square Enix, Kingdom Hearts, very popular game, a lot of people have it. This Black Label version here would be about $20 used online, and you can find the Red Label version about $15, a few dollars less. But as you can see, there is still a difference, even with more recent games. And the PS3, Xbox 360 have the exact same thing going for them in the terms of price discrepancy. If you're looking to create a collection that will impress, which I no doubt think that you are, then having Black Label games will be much nicer for you. Not only do Black Label games look nicer when lined up on a shelf, but seeing a Green Label game stick out amongst the Black Labels is pretty much an eyesore. But there are some instances in which collecting Green Label games is actually beneficial, because sometimes they're completely different games. So here's some examples of that. Here's the Black Label version of Final Fantasy VIII. You can see how the disc there is a little bit holographic and shiny. Over here we have the Green Label version of the game. It's not shiny anymore. It's a bit more colored in. And this happens with pretty much every Final Fantasy game on the PS1. So these are things to look out for. Definitely make sure you have the right version of the game in your case. There are some greatest hits games that are actually completely different than their non-greatest hits counterpart. A good example of this would be Virtua Fighter 4. When it became the greatest hits version, it became Evolution, which featured new characters, tweaked gameplay, and a few other new features that you wouldn't otherwise find in the regular game. So this game only came out as a red label version. So if you're trying to find this as a black label, you're going to have a hard time because from what I can recall, it actually doesn't exist. It's just the regular Virtua Fighter 4. Another good example of this would be Devil May Cry 3. When they released that game, it sold really well, then they had a greatest hits version come out that actually added an entirely new character and game mode to play through, not to mention tweaking the difficulty. But there's an interesting caveat with Devil May Cry 3. Capcom decided to release 1, 2, and 3 as a collector's edition, and in doing so, they released this version of Devil May Cry 3, which is the special edition. You can see it right there. It has the extra gameplay modes, but it is black label. So now you have a game that actually went from being black label to red label with a special edition, and then back to black label. It's a complete reversal. And I don't know of too many instances of something like this happening, but there are some similar cases where on the PlayStation 1, I think Resident Evil 2 was released, it sold well enough, got a greatest hits copy, and the greatest hits one took advantage of the recently released DualShock controller, so you could use analog input for control. And that's only available in the greatest hits green label version, so some collectors might like that because it technically is a different version of the same game. Also worthwhile to note is that PlayStation 2 and 3 greatest hits games will always have this label on the disc itself. It's red here because of the red label version. The regular black label game will not be this way, it'll be black. It's important to note this because resale shops like GameStop, when they repackage their games and you buy them, will oftentimes put the wrong disc in the wrong case because of their filing system. It isn't entirely their fault, but it is good to note, and if you ask them, can I get this version of the game with this disc, they will most likely give it to you. So be aware of this when you're getting your games. Red label game discs always means a greatest hits version. The biggest piece of advice to remember when collecting black label games is to be aware of what you're buying. As the Final Fantasy example showed you, there are some instances where game discs can be physically different when they're released as a greatest hits game, and as Devil May Cry has showed us, there are some instances where just having the non-greatest hits version isn't actually owning the entire game. You might actually want to have the greatest hits version. Okay, let's look at the greatest hits from a completely different standpoint. When a game gets re-released in such a way, it means that it sold well enough and the developers and publishers thought it would be good to re-release the game. So what does that mean for you? Well, it means the game's easier to find. So if you've been trying to find that one game, now it's a bit easier to find because it's been released as a greatest hits title. Not only that, but if you're trying to collect that game, maybe you can't find a black label version, but you can find the green or red label, and it'll be cheaper, and at least you can play it. So definitely a plus. On the other side of that token, and it might be obvious, when a greatest hits game comes out, it almost always lowers the price unanimously for black label, red label, whatever, of that game. So if you have a game that's $50, say, and then they release the greatest hits version, that game might go down $30, $40, it just depends, but almost always it will go down. Even though the black label is still more sought after, now there's less demand for that game because people that just want to play the game, not necessarily collect, can buy the red label for a much cheaper price. That being said, there's still benefits to owning greatest hits versions of games. Again, even owning Final Fantasy VII, the greatest hits version, is still kind of an expensive game, not to mention a really good game. So even owning the greatest hits version is better than owning none. Alright, to wrap up, collecting black label games is a good rule of thumb when looking at two versions. They're usually more sought after, it usually commands a higher price, and no matter what version of the game, you're getting a good quality product. That's not to say that collecting green label is bad, it's just usually when looking at collectors, they want to have the originals. There are some green label games, examples would be Devil May Cry and the Resident Evil game for the PS1 that are actually different versions, and you might want to collect both. So just go into it with an open eye and know what you're looking for. Have a keen eye for those differences. The Final Fantasy discs actually do look different. Aside from the boxes being different, it's something to make sure you know when you buy the game. So ask questions to users online, inspect the game box at the store, and try to find that right price. Some of the fun with these re-released games is that now you see them all the time, you get more into buying it. Now you have to look for the right version. And it can be challenging, but it's really rewarding when it pays off and you find the game in the end. Okay, that is all for this episode. Thank you again for tuning in. If you have any questions, recommendations, comments, or tips for another show, just let me know and I will answer you and get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, take care.